Thank you all for having me here today. I would also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to leaders past, present and emerging. I was watching a STEM education documentary the other day, and there was a bit of a stat that came up on the screen, and that stat was regarding the number of people and the number of young people who were at school who were likely to kind of find employment in jobs that didn't exist. I automatically was a bit sceptical of that number because it looked quite high, and then it dawned on me, oh, I'm in one of those jobs. I'm in one of those jobs where at high school, consulting in the social sector, consulting kind of in a really kind of focusing on strategy and focusing on measurement and evaluation in the social sector did not exist. And I thought, wow, it was a bit of an epiphany for me at that time. But for those of you that don't know Social Ventures Australia, SVA is a non-profit organisation that was started 15 years ago. And it was started 15 years ago around the idea of bringing venture philanthropy to Australia. So venture philanthropy, that those aren't aware of it, is a model whereby you support innovative and look to support innovative organisations and entrepreneurs and helping them to scale the impact of their work. And that was I suppose, the starting of SVA's journey as a VP organisation. Now over time, we've very much kind of expanded and scaled our work so that we've now got 100 people working across offices in Perth, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. We've also got someone based in Darwin at the moment. And we've also increased and, I suppose, broadened our service offerings. So yes, we still have venture philanthropy and a big focus on that, but we also have an impact investing team. Now that team does a lot of work in the social benefit bond space, and they also do and manage a couple of funds that invest direct into social enterprise, invest direct into non-profits. And we also have a non-profit and a consulting practice. And we work a lot with government, we work a lot with non-profits and funders, helping them to get really clear on their strategy and helping them to get really clear on how they track and evaluate the outcomes and the impact of their work. So yeah, I find it a fantastic, a really exciting job. It's a job where I'm able to work with really thoughtful, I suppose, motivated people, but also work on issues which really matter to our country. So, to start, do outcomes matter? I think the title of this, this presentation potentially gave our position away. Absolutely. Measuring social outcomes and the idea of outcomes is non-negotiable in 2018. It is non-negotiable. I'll focus on this kind of question, I'll focus on this topic mainly from a community services, a program point of view. Joe will later, I suppose, take more of a focus from a funder point of view, take more of a focus from the other side of the table. But I think from our perspective and from the work I do, managing social outcomes absolutely matter. It's a question of being able to be accountable and actually demonstrating the impact and the outcomes and what is taking place as a result of an organisation's work. But it's also being accountable to the end beneficiaries. It's accountable to being actually engaged with those participants and in some ways fulfilling the duty of care that community service organisations and other organisations working with people who in many cases are experiencing great vulnerability. It's a duty of care that we owe to them so that the interventions that we are, I suppose, working through with them, the programs that they are participating in, that we have confidence and that we understand that they are in fact contributing to improved livelihoods. They are in fact contributing to better outcomes for that individual. Now, I don't want to be a definitional warrior. So rather than kind of walking through, rather than kind of, I suppose, dissecting what's an output and what's an outcome and how the two shall never meet, I thought what I'd just frame so that we're all kind of broadly on the same page is a way of thinking about linking activities and linking outcomes together. And so I think this is helpful because it starts to help us get clear about, well, what is it we're talking about when we're saying measuring social outcomes. And so wanted to kind of just run through these three really high-level examples. So running a doctor's surgery, what's an outcome of that? Running a doctor's surgery, what changes as a result of that? Well, people get well and people stay healthy. Training guide dogs, what are some of the changes, what are some of the outcomes that might result from that type of intervention? Well, people with low vision, as an example, will have more independence as a result of that intervention. And finally, operating a gym. What is the result of operating a gym? We all have endeavours, we all have aspirations to go to the gym, but what changes? Well, people are healthier. And so that's in terms of being able to specify and define what the outcomes are. But importantly, there's a broader question, there's a follow-up question, which is, well, if these are the outcomes, how do we measure them? Is there a need to measure them? And is there a need to actually be able to demonstrate that as a result of these activities, as a result of the interventions that we are delivering, that those changes do in fact take place? For me, I'm going to walk through a couple of the key drivers of action, and then I'll kind of use a couple of case studies, use a couple of examples to hone in and to really focus on one or two of these. But to start, a key driver of measuring social outcomes, and one of the reasons I would suggest that it is non-negotiable, is that organisations are now seeing it and now being placed into a position where measuring social outcomes is key to sustaining and growing funding. Across kind of government as well as philanthropy and other funders, we're seeing a focus and an increasing shift away from organisations that are wanting kind of heartwarming anecdote stories, and one to where they're actually wanting to see clear, demonstrable kind of evidence of impact. Now, within government, and again we'll come to this in a bit more detail, you're seeing a move away from just kind of buying outputs or buying services to actually thinking about, well, how can we kind of pay for outcomes, how can we actually pay for results? But also within philanthropy, we're seeing a really clear focus and need for organisations to either demonstrate their impact, demonstrate their outcomes as and when they approach the funders, to be able to say, this is an evidence-based, this is a program which delivers tangible benefits, and or here's an idea for a program, here's a pilot, and this is our way of thinking about tracking the outcomes, so that at a point in time, we'll be able to then look at how we might be able to scale this option and actually go to other funders such as government where we can demonstrate the impact of our work. So very much see the need to look at and to examine and consider measuring social outcomes, because it's really important to sustain and grow funding. Another driver that through our work we observe is that measuring social outcomes is key and critical to improving the lives of beneficiaries. Only through having a really clear understanding of, first of all, what the intended outcomes are, as well as a mechanism to track those outcomes, are organisations able to understand whether or not they're actually seeing the desired change, but also where they're not seeing that desired change, what corrective actions they might employ. So I suppose measuring social outcomes is really important because it helps organisations to understand whether or not their theory of change, whether or not their intended outcomes are taking place, and where they're not, to be able to design corrective actions to, I suppose, get people back on the track and get the program back on track for actually achieving the change. A few other drivers that I think are important to note is that there's also kind of measurement helps to find new ways of addressing challenges to social problems, specifically by building knowledge about what works and why non-profit organisations and funders are doing will help us to be able to really understand which initiatives should actually be scaled, which initiatives should be replicated elsewhere, so that where we do see kind of challenges of long-term unemployment, where we do see challenges of education, participation and engagement, we're able to look to what evidence there exists across the ecosystem to identify what interventions, what initiatives might be able to be translated or replicated and scaled to a particular geography or issue. Also, I think it's important to stay competitive. It's really kind of clear that as various funders, as various kind of government services are going to user-directed funding, and there's an increased emphasis on actually services and differentiation and competition across the social services sector, measurement actually becomes really important to actually participate and compete in the market, where users and potential customers will increasingly look to the actual quality of services as well as the outcomes that are delivered through that particular intervention. Finally, on this particular topic and this particular area, measuring social outcomes is really important to help inform and understand how partnerships for social impact are tracking. A lot of our work and a lot of the conversation in the social sector is around place, it's around collective impact, it's around collaboration. And they're all really interesting, I suppose, approaches to try and move the dial in terms of some of these key social issues and key opportunities we want to see change across. But it's also important that we understand where those, I suppose, initiatives are taking place, that they are in fact moving the dial, and that we do have an understanding of what outcomes are taking place for a community and for a population. So I just wanted to kind of firstly present, there's a number of drivers for why measuring social outcomes is important. And then jump into two and kind of give you a couple of case studies. I was working with a mental legal health program a number of years ago. This program was delivering direct legal service, direct legal support to people experiencing mental health issues, as well as it was providing legal education to a broader cross-section of the community. And they spent a lot of time in the early days getting clear on what outcomes and what they should track to ensure that they had a good understanding of how their program was being used, as well as what was changing as a result for the clients and for the individuals that they were working with. By doing this, and it was there were a few simple metrics that they were doing in terms of number of people that were actually attending a legal service, number of people who were actually going on to a case, number of people who were being represented by one of their lawyers. But by identifying a few simple and clear metrics, they were able to understand where there was a clear need, where there was clear demand for a particular service, by also tracking demand and also tracking actually waiting lists and the like, so they were able to understand that. And by doing that, they were then able to shift and move around resources to ensure that that service offering was made available to where the demand was. They were also able to, through kind of various surveying and experience surveys, to actually understand that there was a need to be really clear about the cultural appropriateness of services, as well as how they were working with clients and how they were being used and supported by clients. And so that, again, was something that they were able to track and look at in real time to understand where different training was required for the lawyers themselves, as well as what kind of different configuration of lawyers and how their lawyers could better support the clients given their unique contexts and their unique needs. Now, SVA in this particular example came in to complete an evaluation, an outcomes and process evaluation for this activity and for this program. And what we were then able to do alongside that regular and that routine outcomes measurement piece was take a longer term view. We were able to see, well, what was taking place and what outcomes had been achieved over time and how that did contribute to the organisation's broader aspirations for supporting improved justice and improved access to justice for people with mental health issues, as well as then identify other areas for improvement, identify other areas where the program could, again, course correct or modify how it was being delivered to ensure that it was better meeting the needs and better meeting the needs of clients and actually being a better run, a better delivered service. So that kind of, I suppose, should hopefully give you a bit of a highlight for how an organisation in that context used and saw measurement of social outcomes to ensure that the delivery of their program was actually meeting the needs of end beneficiaries. In a similar vein, I've recently completed an evaluation of a labour market program whereby we were involved in setting up the routine measurement approach and focus of the organisation, as well as doing an outcomes evaluation. Now that enabled this particular program to track outcomes again in real time, being able to see which employers, which initiatives were actually supporting improved retention outcomes. Now that helped that organisation, this helped this program to identify where more job seekers should be, I suppose, kind of prioritised towards. But it also helped to, I suppose, ask the question about, well, what was taking place in one employer where there were outcomes that were relative to others were stronger. And so trying to unpack what was going on to achieve a better set of outcomes than another so that we could translate those learnings across the organisation and across the initiative. Again, and I think there's a bit of a theme here, when a lot of the work we'll be doing with organisations will involve both establishing a routine measurement approach so that organisations can track outcomes in real time, as well as then complementing that by periodic deep dive research and evaluation, so that particularly if over time through that routine measurement piece there are issues that are observed, there are questions that emerge, an evaluation or a periodic evaluation provides an opportunity to then get really, I suppose, explore some of those questions in greater detail with greater, I suppose, attention being given so that there is a good understanding and a triangulation of what the program is seeing as well as an independent voice that yes, this is in fact what is taking place and here are your options to improve outcomes. So that's very much some of the ways that from our work we see measuring social outcomes being important to support and to improve the lives of beneficiaries. The other question on here then, to sustain or grow funding. It's quite interesting when you look at this particular question. For those in the room that do work in the sector, I suppose we all see that there is an increasing shift, an increasing emphasis from government, yes in Australia but also internationally, around this idea of commissioning for outcomes, payment by results. Now this is where government is linking some of their partnerships and the delivery of community services which are funded by government to the achievement of outcomes. Within employment services we see that in Job Active, whereby kind of retention outcomes are linked to payments, but also even in the social benefit bond world, which is where SVA spends a bit of time looking, there's a clear linking of outcomes and the achievement of outcomes to payments. So having in place a robust and a meaningful way of understanding the outcome, understanding what is taking place for the beneficiary is really important to achieve the funding. Importantly as well, those metrics are often the kind of a small number, so in those instances it's also really critical that organisations consider and think through what other outcomes they can be tracking so that they can get an early indication of whether a course correction is required, so that it's not taking place, they're not realising that the program hasn't led or hasn't been delivered in a way or hasn't achieved the change that they'd hoped, where there's kind of funding at risk, but earlier on can identify where course corrections might be required so that that funding can still be, I suppose, achieved. So that's very much from a government point of view that we are seeing an increasing focus on that commissioning for outcomes and the payment by results type models. But as I noted earlier, it's also a focus, and again, many people in the room will be able to attest to this, it's also a focus of philanthropy. And that focus predominantly being at 2 points. One being, well, philanthropy will often ask, organisations often ask programs, well, what is the evidence that your program is able to actually achieve the change that you are saying it will? So that's the first kind of gate, if you will. The other is there's a clear need and there's a clear focus from philanthropy that programs need to be tracking outcomes. Now, when we're playing in the world of catalytic funding, it becomes important for those philanthropists because actually they're wanting to fund early stage initiatives that then have a potential to scale. And so it's really important that organisations, when they are, I suppose, designing, when they are thinking about piloting new programs, that they're able to define how they will also be able to track and evaluate their outcomes so that from a philanthropy point of view, there's a clear exit strategy in play and they're not, I suppose, concerned that there's going to be a constant coming back from that program for return funding. And so there's a clear focus that there are alternatives, there's kind of an avenue to government, there's an avenue to other funders that might exist. So I've spoken through a number of some of the drivers of outcomes measurement. But I think what's also important to take note of is that there's different quality of outcomes measurement, there's different quality of evaluation that exists. Now what I've got up here is what's called the evidence hierarchy. And this shows that at the top we've got systematic reviews, followed by randomized controlled trials, realist reviews, and then program descriptions and opinions. And I think it's important to note that when we are talking about outcomes measurement, we're not always talking about RCTs. We're not always talking about systematic reviews. Absolutely, when we're talking about replicating programs at scale across the population, we should, and government absolutely looks to what the evidence that systematic reviews from the RCTs do say. But when we are talking about the organisation or the program level, that level of rigour is not always required. It's costly for one, but it's also difficult and it takes time. RCTs can take a lot of time. Has anyone in this room been involved in an RCT? Well, just as a bit of a kind of, a spoiler, RCTs can take 3 to 5 to 10 years depending on what you're trying to look for. So it actually takes a long time to actually get that level of rigour and that level of evidence. And so quite often we also need to think about the quality and the effort that is going in to design the evaluation and the measurement piece. A virtuous cycle. In terms of our work, how we often, and where we often spend our time and attention is kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning, SVA Consulting does a lot of work around purpose, a lot of work around vision and strategy. And so that's really important that for a program or for an organisation, we're crystal clear about what the intended outcomes are. But once we have that clarity, once we've got a really, I suppose, good and deep and agreed understanding about what that looks like, we then move over to theory and design. And this is where we do then work with organisations. This is where we do focus and consider, well, what's the fit for purpose? What's the appropriate way of tracking outcomes? So identifying recommendations, then those recommendations will typically consider some of the course corrections, some of the improvements that can be made that concern itself with acting. And importantly, then it goes back to theory and design. There's also a need, there's also an important point to iterate. Now, talking earlier with a few people, I think we can get a bit scared by this process and we can get a bit scared by just the work and the effort that's involved. But also, we can, it's an iterative cycle where you can start small and you can expand as the team, as the organisation becomes more experienced and more familiar with actually tracking outcomes and then actually managing to outcomes. In terms of that theory and design piece, also just want to kind of show one of the tools that you'll all kind of have probably seen in one way or form is a logic model. Now, a logic model is a clear articulation and representation of really what the theory behind the program is. So it starts with an issue typically, which really describes what social problem or what issue is being addressed by the program. We'll describe the participants, who's actually involved in the program, and being quite clear about that. It will often talk to the evidence. What is the evidence behind the program? What is the evidence that is informing our decision to do X, Y, and Z? We'll then set out the activities, and that will be a clear articulation about what is actually being delivered, what is actually taking place in terms of the program, what is actually being delivered across the community to support and to deliver and address the issue. Then the logic model will outline a number of consequences, and this could include outputs as well as short, medium, and longer term outcomes. And this is where there's a representation and a specification of what those key outcomes do look like and how they are linked to one another. And then finally, there is a kind of articulation of the impact. And that is, I suppose, in some ways very much mirrored to the issue, but it's a description, it's a statement about what the desired end state is through delivering this particular program. So I realise I've walked through a number of different parts of the measurement and evaluation kind of process and why it's important. But I do want to conclude that measuring social outcomes can be hard. It can be resource intensive, And it can also shine the light on issues and on questions that sometimes we wouldn't like, sometimes that are hard to look at. So it can absolutely be hard. But I'd also like to suggest that it is kind of rewarding, and it is really a responsibility and non-negotiable for the social sector in 2018. It helps and supports organisations around questions of funding. It supports questions and issues of supporting end beneficiaries, and it also supports organisations to really prove and improve. So I'll leave it there for now.
There's going to be a lot of consistency in the messages that you're hearing, which is good. The trick for you, I guess the challenge for you is taking it back to your organisation and really honing in on the consistency and the necessity for outcome measurement to be embedded in what your organisation is doing. It is no longer a trend, impact investment, outcomes reporting. It is the norm, it is the expectation of the funders. So if your organisation isn't doing it now, it needs to start doing it now. But I've got to say I'm impressed with how many organisations in the room are actually measuring their performance, which is fantastic. Because what we're seeing consistently around the globe is the necessity for NGOs to be able to report on how well you're doing what you're doing. Okay, so as Nick's already spoken about, the government and philanthropic messages are the same. So has anybody been involved in a social benefit bond bid? All right, well, if you want to be ready for that and in a position to be able to put in a social benefit bond, you need to be able to measure what your outcomes are, because that is what you're being paid on. You're being paid on the delivery of your outcomes. So sophisticated financial modelling in place around that, but it's a necessity. So also philanthropy. So just a little snippet from the Philanthropy Australia's Guide to Grant Making, and they're actually advising what trusts and foundations are asking for in their acquittal report. And as you can see here, what was the impact of the project? So they're advising this is what philanthropists should be asking of the beneficiaries. And were there any outcomes from the project that you didn't expect? And if so, what were they? So what we come across in our work with NGOs certainly is a fear that when something doesn't go according to plan, when they're delivering the program, they are really worried about that, and what is the funder going to say? So has anyone had a case where you've had funding and things have gone completely differently to what you expected they would? Yeah, and you reported back to the funder about that? Yeah, absolutely, and then you've got to, and it is how then you use that data to learn. So what have you learnt from that whole process? And if you can then tell a funder that, well, we actually had a completely different hypothesis. We thought this was going to happen by this type of program. What we actually found was this happened. And if that is then influencing the way your organisation implements programs going forward, that is a winning situation. And what's even better then, if you then disseminate those learnings to the wider sector so that others who are doing similar work to you are also learning. So when we're looking at the likes, well, first of all, go through this funder expectations, but I've got an example from the Employer Foundation coming up shortly. So what the funders are expecting that you can tell them is, what's the track record of your organisation? Now, while that seems a really basic question, it is surprising when we're asking for data from organisations on what are your key achievements. It's not always easy to find in one central location. So a part of your whole performance measurement evaluation is a data collation exercise. So usually the data does exist within your organisation, but is it being collated and analysed and reported on in a meaningful way that is going to help you get more funding through the door? So how do you know there's a need for your work? This is a really big gap. Certainly we work with literally hundreds of funding submissions across government, high-level federal, significant millions of dollars, right down to smaller philanthropic grants. The evidence of need is what is fundamentally missing in a lot of funding applications. So an organisation might cite what they know, but what they're not looking at is then the broader evidence base. So that requires literature reviews and comparisons to what is going on in the sector so that you can clearly demonstrate with data where the gaps are in the marketplace that you are seeking to fill. How will you know that your suggested approach is going to work? What difference will the project actually make? So again, coming into that outcomes measurement that we'll talk a little bit more about and expanding on what Nick's already said, and how you're going to know that you've really made a difference. So what is the impact? Has there been a systemic change in the work that you've done? So again, funder expectations, looking at the Ian Potter Foundation, who very much have a philosophy of innovate, evaluate and disseminate. So their expectation is that you're not just going to measure performance and learn from that, but how are you then going to share those learnings with the broader sector? So where you can do that in your proposal, that's going to be a winner. So just looking at their acquittal form, it requires both qualitative and quantitative data. Did you reach your goals? So what they want you to do is list all the goals that you said you were going to achieve in your initial funding application. You need to be able to then answer whether you've achieved each one separately and provide the data behind it to prove that. Did you collect any measurements on long-term outcomes along the way? And have the outcomes already been shared with others? If so, how? So to make sure that you can address all these questions in the acquittal process, you're going to need to ensure, of course, that these evaluation methodologies are embedded in the program planning stage of your organisation's activities. So we'll come to that in a moment. Perpetual then, I'm sure most of you in the room have applied for Perpetual Trustees funding. Yes, yep, there's a few nods. So applications are assessed against the outcomes criteria. They're looking for evidence of realistic, measurable, achievable goals and outcomes, including societal impact, and ask that applicants look beyond the outputs related to the request and demonstrate the potential impact of their activities. Now that's very much at an activity level. Again, for those of you who have worked with the Perpetual form, there's a lot around the organisational performance measurement with the KPIs, around efficiency and effectiveness. So again, it's quite surprising how many organisations struggle with actually defining what your efficiency KPIs are, what your effectiveness KPIs are, and furthermore, how you're actually performing against each set of KPIs over any given period. So again, if you can't do those, it's a good place to start having a look at that form if you don't have really robust performance measurement processes in place. So looking at where evaluation fits in the program planning in every part, really. And it's so important again that evaluation is embedded at the time the program planning stage starts. So right, number one with the needs analysis, as I already spoke about. We need to have data not just based on what we know as an organisation who is expert in what we do, otherwise why we exist. So if we don't have that data set, we do, but it's collating it. So if we don't have it collated, get it collated, okay? Get it analysed, and so that you can then present it in a relevant, meaningful way. Then we use that to identify, well, what do we need to do? Where aren't we meeting our mission? Okay, and what's the market gap for our services? Then we set up what is the monitoring and evaluation framework for that particular project going to look like. So these are the outcomes we want to achieve. How are we going to measure them? What are the tools going to be? Then we'll approach the funders. So again, we'll review who's the most appropriate funder for that specific project that we need funding for. So we're looking at the funder's intent and and what they want to achieve with that particular funding pool, and where that matches our program's outcomes, we've got a really nice strategic fit. And then of course you're going to do all the other necessary things like ring them and build a relationship and have great conversations with them. Then you'll do your program implementation, of course, and then, as we've spoken a lot about already today, your program improvement, so your action research piece. How are you applying the learning of the program as you're doing it to inform what happens next? So again, that's not a negative thing to be learning and adjusting and changing as the program goes. That is an expectation. So that's what your government and your philanthropic funders want to see, that you are applying those learnings through an action research methodology into the program delivery. So again, writing your evaluation plan right at program planning start defines what are the questions that you need to be asking as you go. It defines what the information is that you need to be collecting. And of course then, what do we need to do? We need to educate everyone in the organisation who's involved in the actual delivery of the program as to all of these things that they are going to be required to collect, but more importantly, why. So it's really important for you to spend time with the people that are actually doing the delivering the services and programs that fulfil your mission as to what funding expectations are, why do we need to be collecting and collating this data. So for whom and how you'll collect the information, what are the issues and risks. So again, a common application form question from funders is, what are the project's risks and what are your mitigation strategies? All right, so they want to know that you have a contingency plan if things do deviate. Basically, they want to invest in winners and they want to see capability and competency. There's a timeline, of course. What are the resources that you're going to need? So that's an interesting one. There was a survey done by the Centre for Social Impact that asked philanthropists about their willingness to invest in non-profit program evaluation. And the response was greater than 50% said, yep, we would definitely consider that, or they do it. And then the same question was asked of non-profit organisations as to whether they thought that philanthropists would fund their program evaluation, and most of them said no. So there's a fundamental lack of understanding and communication around whether we will fund evaluation, and we want to fund evaluation because we're asking you for outcomes, to the people that are applying for the funding. Oh, we can't ask them for that, they think it's a core cost or whatnot. And it should be a core cost, really. It should be one of the core operational costs of an organisation measuring performance, but often it's not. So it's always good to have that conversation with your prospective funding partner as to whether they will provide budget within your program costs to run an evaluation and get an accurate quote for it. And what you're going to then do with the information. So again, you know, I saw quite a few people sitting down when asked the question, have you got the data? Are you using the data to inform the future strategy and direction of the organisation? All right, so don't just go and collect it and let it sit on a shelf. It's there for a reason. So this is a neat little case study of a really fabulous piece of work that our team conducted with an international NGO who are working in a developing country, providing education. Their vision is to reduce poverty because they're working with community, and education is at the very crux of that. So recognising that if we can educate kids, then it's going to have a flow-on effect, which it is, and you'll soon see some wonderful outcomes and, in fact, huge impact. It was a two-stage process for us. So like many organisations, there was years and years, in fact 10 years of data, and it wasn't all collected in a consistent way. But it was fabulous. So the first job for us, lucky I've got lots of data nerds in my team, was sifting through it all and analysing it and collating it, and not just the quantitative stuff, but looking for all the patterns and what the outcomes were, and grouping all the qualitative outcomes. And what then that did was presented, okay, we've gone from just collecting this data and now we've got evidence of our outcomes. So we know that there are changes that are occurring here. We've got quantitative statistics to back it all up, and now we can present it in a meaningful way to our stakeholders so that we can tell the story about the difference we are making and why we need more funding to do that. What it also did, though, is identified where they weren't collecting the data that they needed to confirm other outcomes that, in theory, they knew they were doing, but the actual questions they were asking weren't giving them that database. Right? So, outcome under investigation, for example, was the level of quality education that was being provided for these kids in this community. The current evidence that they had was the student exam data. So the evidence quality, it was partial, because it was really mainly quantitative data that they had, not a lot of qualitative. The recommended key performance indicators for future data collection was that what they wanted to really see is that there was an increase in students' performance over time. So looking at the difference between when they came into the program, the longer they were involved in the program, keeping them in school, and the outcomes that that ultimately was going to have. And then the data collection requirements needed to move beyond just looking at the exam data to a lot of qualitative data, a teacher assessment, talking to the students, talking to their parents, talking to other community members about not just their attendance rate, but what else was changing in these kids' behaviour and attitude. And because we're talking about a developing country here, keeping kids in school, there is and nutrition. So it was looking at all those other influences and how we had to how the program has to intervene in those, providing holistic education, not just literacy and learning through school, the normal schools program. Okay, so then step 2 was actually using the data that was collected through an outcomes map and setting it up to identify, well, what's missing? What else do we need to know? So there were key evaluation questions designed and indicators were developed. We defined who needed to collect the data and how they were going to do it. Now the challenge is, in a non-English speaking country where you've got very low literacy levels, designing data collection tools that are relevant again. So again, it's really vital that you know who is going to be collecting the data and designing your tools in a relevant, well, they've got to be relevant tools to make sure that that data collection is going to happen. So an example of a key evaluation question that was asked, to what extent is the program producing worthwhile educational results for the school children? Big question. So the goal. The goal here is to provide high quality accessible education to primary school age children. The indicator, or one of them, this is just one example, there were many indicators, was the percentage of children who had to go back and repeat the same year level. And what they wanted to do, their target was to have a better result than the national average. So they wanted to ensure that under 9.6% of the kids had to go back and repeat. And they're well and truly keeping that goal out of the park, which is fabulous. And then the methods and tools in that particular space were largely quantitative. So moving into some of the qualitative tools then that we set up for them, and they're just about to put the participatory method in with the community workshopping piece, which is really exciting. So it's an ongoing piece of work. But so the M&E framework's now in use. We've designed the methodologies for them to use in line with the new outcomes that they needed to have evidence for. The organisational capacity of the staff is what's really cool. So what is happening, and again this is one of those ancillary outcomes, is that they're sending staff and students out to do learning in the community, and then they're bringing back what they learn and having classes, daily, a day long I should say, workshops with other students in the school and with other teachers in the school to share that learning. So big impact stuff there. The organisation now has a roadmap of who's involved in the evaluation, when it needs to happen and how it needs to happen. And they're monitoring data on the progress, identifying the emerging needs. So when there is a disease outbreak, for example, what are the processes that they need to put in place to minimise spread? Again, it's about helping keep the kids in school to maintain that education. Another big challenge was, and you can see in the mapping diagram that's being used, to get the feedback from the parents and the teachers and other community members. But one of the challenges is when the parents want the kids to go and help at market day. Okay, so they need extra help selling their products at a market day, which means taking them out of school. And so those are some of the things that have decreased because they're realising the importance. Well, if we take them out of school, their long-term education and the benefits that we're seeing through the program, through the stage one of the process that we did, are going to be greatly affected. All right. So you can see in this case, it's needed to be very cultural specific, very community specific, using diagrams for people to circle things on what they feel is changing in their community. And just looking at some of those things, even the age to marry and have children. So for young girls in developing country, that's a real challenge, you know. There's that cultural expectation in some places that they will go and get married rather than stay in school and get an education. So all of this is shifting. So, but we weren't collecting this data originally. Now we've got some amazing data that can be used in other models, education models around the world. So, neat little example there. So what we need to do when considering our evaluation tools is keep in mind the following. What are you measuring and why? What audience was the tool created for and tested with? So make sure that you're testing the tools and make sure that they work. What context or setting is the tool meant for? Again, in this case, we needed to make sure that we had tools that were appropriate for low literacy. And do you have the expertise to be able to judge the appropriateness and the quality of the tool, and that it's actually going to get you the data that you need, okay, to measure those outcomes. So quantitative tools, I won't go through all that, you're all probably familiar with that. Qualitative is probably the area that we see organisations struggle with in understanding how can you collect qualitative data. And yes, you know, evaluation, when you're doing it properly, it is a big process, but there are some simple ways to collect really good data. And there are funders, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the likes of the English Family Foundation. So Alan English hates acquittal reports, doesn't want the paperwork, doesn't have the time to read them. What he wants is a video of a beneficiary of the program to say what has changed in their lives as a result of the program that has just received the funding. Then just go to the CEO or whomever it is and back it up with, and there are 500 other kids just like that. For him, that's enough, and for a lot of philanthropic funders, that round table reporting mechanism is what is becoming a more relevant way. So you still have to have the data to go and do that, of course, and you need to be able to give some really good qualitative case studies and examples of what has changed behaviourally, attitudinally, etc. So, you know, there are a lot of simple things like focus groups and interviews and surveys that you can And so using our logic model, or just a small part thereof, in the case study that we were just talking about, breaking it down, and this is just such a nice visual way in really simple terms to report back to a funder. Obviously you have all your inputs there because that's what they've probably given you the funding for. Your activities, again just taking a little snippet of them, what the outputs have been, using some graphic representation to show the growth, the outcomes, the percentage who are achieving across certain subjects, what their perceptions are, in this case of self-efficacy, and what we could do with the 10-year-old data that we had is show differentials between when they started in year 1 and year 7 and their increased ability to actually manage all the different parts of their life, including their education, which was really cool. And then the impact, and again in this case it's a real whole of community effect that this education program is having. And then there's lots of case studies that have been collected, outcome graphs that are mapped over time, etc. So when you're presenting a report, a nice simple way, and this is a very simplistic version of the total logic model, but having that as a front and then backing it up with all of that data and more graphic representation that goes into the detail is a really nice way to be able to present that to your funding partners and stakeholders. And I think that wraps us up.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great.